Who is the worst kind of person to be sat next to on a long flight? Story 1. I once sat next to a man on a 4 to 5 hour flight who had a strong, unpleasant smell, like a zoo animal. He was dressed in a suit and tie but appeared nervous with sweat dripping down his face. The only item he carried was a Bible, which he occasionally looked at through the flight. On another occasion, I found myself on a hot plane, stuck on the tarmac, next to a German woman who emitted a repugnant odor. It was so overwhelming that she had to lift her arm and use a napkin to wipe her armpit. I felt like I wanted to disappear from the planet. Story 2. During a flight, I sat next to an elderly man in an aisle seat who was over 90 years old. Unfortunately, he pooped himself immediately after the plane started taxiing to the runway. The smell was unbearable, but because he required assistance to get up and the flight was completely full, I had no choice but to endure the unpleasant odor throughout the flight. After landing, I was forced to wait until the elderly man was assisted out of the plane, as he required a wheelchair. This meant that I had to watch everyone else disembark and leave while I was still trapped in the plane with the unpleasant smell. Story 3. During a flight, I was forced to sit next to a Mennonite woman who was holding her large infant, who appeared to be around 18 months old. I wasn't supposed to sit next to her, as I had been assigned a seat next to someone else. However, the father of the Mennonite family seemed to have little understanding of flying, or perhaps thought he could dictate where everyone sat, so he made each family member sit where he wanted them to. The wife ended up next to me, while the intended seatmate switched with her. Unfortunately, the infant pooped himself within the few minutes of the flight, and the mother did nothing about it. Perhaps she didn't realize there was a bathroom on the plane, so for the next 4 hours, I was stuck sitting next to a smelly baby who kept kicking my leg for amusement. To make matters worse, none of the Mennonites were deodorant, so the mother's odor was also unpleasant. It was an incredibly unpleasant experience. Story 4. I once boarded a plane and immediately noticed a distinctive smell. I couldn't pinpoint the source, but the passenger next to me seemed to smell it too and gave me a look of disgust. We quickly realized that the smell wasn't coming from either of us, so we joined forces to adjust the air blowers in an attempt to alleviate the odor. As we were doing this, we started hearing call buttons being pressed from a few rows back. Soon after, a couple of passengers were removed from the plane. It turned out that the man in 3 rows back had such a body odor that someone had vomited, causing a chain reaction of more passengers throwing up. We all had to deplane so the plane could be sanitized. My seatmate and I concluded that the smell we had initially detected was indeed from the back row guy and not vomit. I'll always be grateful to all the passengers who vomited, as they saved us from enduring a 6-hour flight in unbearable stench. Story 5. During a flight to Iceland before COVID, I sat next to a man who was alarmingly smelly. He looked like he had been wearing the same clothes for ages and kept aggressively scratching inside his sleeves. When we landed, I saw him retrieve a road bike from his luggage, which made me wonder if he had been on a long bike trip. However, it was puzzling to me why he wouldn't have showered and changed his clothes, considering he had flown from Austin and there were certainly showers available there. To make matters worse, I started my period during the flight and had a heightened sense of smell, which made the experience even more uncomfortable. Story 6. I was flying home from a college friend's reunion. I was hungover and exhausted. All I wanted to do on that flight was sleep. I was seated next to a lady who was writing in a tablet. She kept looking over at me. I thought she had thought I was trying to read what she was writing, so I settled back and closed my eyes. When I gave my drink request to the flight attendant, the woman next to me caught my eye. She said, "Would you like to read my poetry?" I wasn't hardened enough to say no, so I spent the rest of the miserable flight reading and talking about her poetry. Story 7. When I was 14, I flew alone for the first time and had a scary encounter. I was woken up from my sleep by a man asking me about my iPod. He went on to tell me that he drove buses for pop stars like Britney Spears. At the time, I thought he was a nice guy, but looking back, his story seemed like an obvious attempt to appeal to a young teenager. What made the situation even more concerning was that he was surprised to find out that I and the other unaccompanied minors on the plane were not allowed to get off until everyone else had left. Thankfully, we had a chaperone with us, which made me realize that something wasn't quite right with this man's behavior. Years later, I came to the realization that I may have dodged an attempted abduction that day. It's scary to think what could have happened if I hadn't had a chaperone or if I had fallen for his ploy. It's an experience that has stayed with me and reminds me to always be cautious of strangers, even if they seem friendly. Story 8. I will never forget this moment on a plane. The people behind me had a toddler who needed a diaper change, but instead of taking the child to the restroom, they decided to do it right there in their seat. The smell was unbearable, and even with the air vents on full blast, it seemed impossible to escape the stench. Other passengers were gagging, and I couldn't believe what I was experiencing. It was definitely a flight to remember, for all the wrong reasons. Story 9. On a long flight from Auckland to Los Angeles, I sat next to a pleasant and interesting British man. He explained that it was cheaper to buy a boat in the Caribbean and sail it back to New Zealand than to purchase it there. However, during the 14-plus hour flight, the guy had become a bit of a snuggler. I woke up 3 times to find him asleep on my shoulder, his hand in my armpit. Pushing him off didn't seem to faze him, and he remained the same at the end of the flight. While not the worst experience, it's not something I would have expected or wanted on a long-haul flight. Thank you for watching our video on the worst kind of person to be sat next to on a long flight. We hope you found these stories informative and entertaining. If you have any similar experiences or thought you'd like to share, please leave them in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more videos. Your support means a lot to us and help us create more great videos. Remember, you never know who you might be sitting next to on your next flight, so always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. See you in the next video.